Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to this third session of monetary policy discussions, where we are like focusing on building concepts, understanding the linkages, and ensuring that we are in comfortable position to actually know, understand, and decipher how the economic processes, transactions, phenomenon occur uh, between the players and amongst the systems of complex element that Indian or let's say the world economy is. Last time, I think I have missed out on this discussion about the monetary policy transmission. So we'll first start with this. Then we'll talk about the monetary policy management framework in India, which is driven by the Monetary Policy Committee. And then I'll finish up things with the instruments by which the money supply and monetary policy and money supply is actually like done in the case of India. To begin with today's discussion, first understand what monetary policy transmission is, because there was this discussion in our group as well, whereby one of the candidates talked about how like M0, M1, M2 liquidity actually is present in there. So to give you a bit of discussion, the M0, which is like the liability of the Monetary Authority of India, which is like the RBI, does not always reflect into commensurate increase in the money supply across the actors which are present in the Indian economy. What are those actors? So एक तो सबसे पहले एक्टर है अपना RBI, which is the Monetary Authority of इंडिया, एंड इसकी जो लाइबिलिटी है वही M0 बनाता है, वही मनी सप्लाई बनाता है. तो इसी के लाइबिलिटी से हम लोग बैंक्स के पास में जाते हैं, जो बैंक्स फिर उसके पास में कुछ आरडीआर रहता है, कुछ सीडीआर रहता है, जो भी कुछ रहता है, मतलब उसके पास में एक रेशियो रहता है, उसके पास में एक रहता है. अब ये अपनी क्रेडिट क्रिएशन कैपेसिटी से ये लोगों में क्रेडिट बनाता है. दिस इज हाउस होल्ड और दिस इज कॉर्पोरेट्स, और ये क्रेडिट बनाता है. एंड फिर अब इनके क्रेडिट बनाने से मनी सप्लाई डिसाइड होता है. दैट्स हाउ वी हैव टॉक्ड एन नंबर ऑफ टाइम्स. एंड I have also discussed that the credit creation capacity of banks actually depend upon what sort of assets they have, what is their quality of their balance sheets, then banking habit of the people, and so on. We have already discussed this. Another very central part of it is how does like the entire monetary policy transmission takes place in terms of policy measures that existed. पॉलिसी मेजर्स कौन से हैं वो मैं आज बताऊंगा, पर मैंने बताया भी हो कि भाई बैंक रेट्स है, सीआरआर है, एसएलआर है, रेपो ऑपरेशन है, ये सारे बैंक रेट्स ही है ना. तो इन बैंक रेट्स के सहारे कैसे ट्रांसमिशन हो रहा है, मतलब जैसे अगर आरबीआई ने कहा कि चलो आई एम डिक्रीजिंग योर बैंक रेट, आई एम डिक्रीजिंग योर रेपो, तो क्या एक्चुअल में इसी के कमेंसुरेट डिक्रीज इन कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरोइंग फॉर अ कंज्यूमर होता है क्या? तो ये जो होता है क्या, दिस इज कॉल्ड एज मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी ट्रांसमिशन. सो इट इज हाउ पॉलिसी एक्शंस ऑफ आरबीआई आर ट्रांसमिटेड अक्रॉस द सेगमेंट्स. RBI in economic survey and RBI governors, multiple RBI governors in the past have talked about the fact that monetary policy transmission in India, first it is poor and secondly it is delayed. पुअर का मतलब क्या है कि जो जिस कमेंसुरेट वे में डिक्रीज इन पॉलिसी रेट्स करते हैं या फिर इंक्रीज इन पॉलिसी रेट्स करते हैं. अभी डिक्रीज एंड इंक्रीज इन पॉलिसी रेट्स किस लिए चाहिए? टू मैनेज इन्फ्लेशन या फिर टू मैनेज डिमांड या फिर टू मैनेज ग्रोथ. इफ द हाईएस्ट controller of the credit, which is RBI, is not able to control the entire monetary supply, then its role becomes in question. And that has been the like a cause of concern for RBI and as well as for the economy of India, because the transmission is poor and transmission is delayed. Why the transmission is poor? Because there is a case of interest rate. So what is the interest rate? We know that like banks actually they take deposits at let's say 6% and then they lend at 10%. So the spread is often like the 4% is their profit, and for that profit banks की सारी मेहनत है. अब इसी में क्या है कि इसी में अगर जैसे मान लो कि अगर आपका डिपॉजिट रेट फिक्स है, डिपॉजिट में आपने एक बारी 7% पे 7.2% पर किसी का एफडी खुलवा लिया. अब क्या हुआ कि अब ये एफडी 6 साल के लिए है, तब पॉलिसी इंटरेस्ट रेट भी 10% के थे, तो फिर बैंक्स वेर हैविंग 10% माइनस 7.2%, विच इज लाइक कितना 2.8% का स्प्रेड था उसके पास में. बट अब क्या किया आरबीआई ने, ये जो लेंडिंग रेट है वो कम कर दिया, तो अगर लेंडिंग रेट कम किया तो फिर द क्रेडिट मस्ट गेट चीपर। तो बैंक्स के एसेट जिस रेट पे वो देते थे उनको चीपर करना पड़ेगा। अब वो 9% से 10% से अगर उन्होंने उसको 9% किया, तो पर बैंक्स को एफडी पे इंटरेस्ट तो 7.2 पे ही देना है, तो 9 माइनस 7.2 which is like 1.8 becomes their spread. So this spread gets decreased. So in case of India, the interest spread have been more rigid. तो दैट एक्चुअली मेक्स पुअर मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी ट्रांसमिशन पुअर। क्यों? जैसे मैंने अब अभी बताया कि बैंक्स के पास में ऑलरेडी डिपॉजिट रहते हैं, और उनको उन्हीं बेसिस पे अपनी लाइबिलिटीज को केटर करना पड़ता है, अपने लाइबिलिटीज को सर्विस करना पड़ता है। बट डिक्रीज इन पॉलिसी रेट वुड एक्चुअली लाइक रिड्यूस देयर स्प्रेड, and it actually makes them impacts the profitability of lots. Mm. So that's why like they are not very eager to cut down on interest rate, not eager. Second is small savings scheme. अब जैसे let's say there is a post office, एंड पोस्ट ऑफिस में बहुत सारी आरडीज रहती है, फिर सुकन्या समृद्धि है, फिर किसान विकास पत्र है, फिर वो अटल पेंशन योजना है। अब ये सारी क्या है? स्मॉल सेविंग्स स्कीम है। स्मॉल क्यों? क्योंकि इनमें एक लिमिट रहता है, 10 लाख का, 20 लाख का, 30 लाख का, कुछ एक लिमिट रहता है, उसी के कमेंसुरेट आप सेविंग्स कर सकते हो। पर ये स्मॉल सेविंग्स स्कीम्स रहती है ना, इनके इंटरेस्ट रेट जो रहते हैं वो हायर रहते हैं। तो अगर इनके इंटरेस्ट रेट हायर है, तो पीपल विथ सम डिपॉजिट ऑफ लेट्स से 10 लाख रुपीज, what they would do, they would rather invest in small saving schemes of post rather than depositing the same amount with the banks. तो अगर वो बैंक के साथ में डिपॉजिट नहीं कर रहे हैं, तो बैंक्स के पास के डिपॉजिट्स कम हो रहे हैं, तो फिर उनके पास में अवेलेबिलिटी ऑफ फंड्स टू लेंड कम है, तो फिर उससे क्या होगा कि लेंडिंग रेट्स क्रेडिट कॉस्टलियर, lending rates increased. I hope like you are getting my point. Then again, next thing is bank do not borrow much from RBI. If let's say bank आरबीआई ने अपने पॉलिसी रेट्स कम किए, बट बैंक्स का लेंडिंग का और डिपॉजिट्स का वो पार्ट बहुत बड़ा है ही नहीं, तो फिर बैंक्स के लेंडिंग कैपेसिटी पे और बोरोइंग कैपेसिटी पे उनको बहुत ज्यादा इंपैक्ट पड़ता नहीं है। तो इस केस में भले ही वो मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी चीपर करे या मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी कॉस्टलियर करे, वो फर्क नहीं पड़ता। तो मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी ट्रांसमिशन पुअर होता है। नेक्स्ट इज एसेट क्वालिटी। अब हाउ डज एसेट क्वालिटी प्ले इनटू द डिस्कशन? So if let's say that there are NPAs with the bank, then banks are a bit hesitant to lend. So even if there is a cheaper credit, banks would make more scrutiny, more the deliberations, more due diligences while giving the credit. This actually like decreases overall supply of credit. And the delay is because why? The overall actions, overall economic factors, overall transmissions are actually slowed because of these factors. Why? Because the transmission is poor and transmission delayed. Why? Because I mean the banking habits are limited, the asset quality is poor, the interest rate does not guarantee like immediate and effective transmission of monetary policy. I'm sorry, the breaks in between would be the thing where I go and get a sip of water. So please don't get irritated by it and just don't lose your patience. And मतलब भाई अब वीडियो बंद ही कर मत देना। अब हूँ मैं यहीं पे हूँ, सब कुछ बता के ही जाऊंगा, बिना बताए कुछ भी नहीं जाऊंगा। और भाई अब इतनी मेहनत कर रही है तो थोड़ा सा, गर्मी भी इतनी है तो फिर पानी तो पीना ही पड़ता है, वो तो आपको भी पता ही है। तो चलो, मैं क्या कह रहा था कि डिले इज बिकॉज देयर इज अ सिग्निफिकेंट इनफॉर्मल इकोनॉमी एस्पेक्ट एज वेल। अब मैं यहाँ पे ब्लैक यूज नहीं कर रहा डेलिबरेटली। व्हाई? बिकॉज ब्लैक डजंट नेसेसरीली मीन कि सारा का सारा इनफॉर्मल ब्लैक ही है। इनफॉर्मल का पार्ट ब्लैक है कि जो डिक्लेयर्ड एज इनकम नहीं है, बट कुछ एक्चुअल में इनफॉर्मल ही है, अनऑर्गेनाइज्ड है, आउटसाइड द एम्बिट्स है। तो ये होने की वजह से भी डिले है। And most important aspect is there is an imported inflation in India driven by oils, driven by pulses, driven by the critical resources. अब जैसे APIs फॉर फार्मा है, जैसे कि क्रिटिकल मिनरल्स है। तो फिर उसके बाद में प्रोटीन इन्फ्लेशन इन इंडिया है कि कैसे प्रोटीन इन्फ्लेशन, फूड में भी ग्रेन्स के रेट्स नहीं बढ़ते हैं पर प्रोटीन के जैसे कि मिल्क का, जैसे कि पल्सेस का। फिर उसी के बाद में फैट इन्फ्लेशन है इंडिया में, ऑयल्स के रेट बढ़ रहे हैं, अब वो एडिबल ऑयल है या फिर अब वो क्रूड ऑयल है। तो इन सब के केस में इंपोर्टेड इन्फ्लेशन की वजह से व्हाट हैपेंस, द मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी ट्रांसमिशन इजंट वेरी इफेक्टिव। What I mean by it, so if let's say RBI increases the policy rates amidst increasing inflation, then it wouldn't be of very significance. Why? Because the inflation is supply led, not the demand led. So even if like you decrease the demand, but the inflation wouldn't reduce. Why? Because the actual price of the good at its origin has higher price, because why, it's imported. अब देखो इसी डिस्कशन से इंपोर्टेड इन्फ्लेशन है एंड मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी ट्रांसमिशन पुअर है, मेंस में भी 2 बार क्वेश्चन आ चुका है एंड इवन आईएफओएस मेंस में भी 1 बार क्वेश्चन आ चुका है, आई थिंक 2024 में था ये। So understand this concept very well, that there is an imported inflation and monetary policy in India is not so effective. Why? Because it's poor, it's delayed, and it's not able to contour and conquer the imported inflation wala aspect. I hope like this discussion is very clear with you. To actually address the monetary policy transmission and to have like what you can say effective monetary policy in India, there came a monetary policy reforms which were driven by the Urjit Patel Committee in 2015, जो सबसे सबसे कॉमन है, and it actually established to review and strengthen monetary policy framework in India. What they did is they actually submitted set of recommendations. First recommendation was that put CPI as a nominal anchor rather than WPI. अब WPI से क्या रहेगा कि even though like it's good for the fact that ये होलसेल प्राइस इंक्लूड करता है, टैक्सेस एंड सब्सिडीज को इंक्लूड नहीं करता है, बट दैट वाजंट गिविंग द क्लियरर पिक्चर, नो क्लियरर पिक्चर ऑफ द इन्फ्लेशन। खैर सीपीआई के भी अपने ड्रॉबैक्स है, वो हम लोग डिस्कस करेंगे जब इन्फ्लेशन और इंडाइसेस डिस्कस करेंगे तब। पर मेन थिंग इज उसने सर्विसेज, सीपीआई में सर्विसेज इंक्लूड होती है और ये कंज्यूमर्स पे इंपैक्ट बताता है। एट द सेम टाइम डब्ल्यूपीआई जो है वो केवल गुड्स बताता है और वो केवल प्रोड्यूसर्स पे के ऊपर इंपैक्ट बताता है। तो फिर सीपीआई कंबाइंड, सीपीआई के भी मल्टीपल वो है, पर सीपीआई कंबाइंड was put in as a nominal anchor for the inflation addressing. Then also it focuses on like they talked about the fact that how to actually, I mean, what should be the basis for RBI's monetary policy actions. So Urjit Patel Committee recommendation said that inflation targeting should be the basis. Rather, I should go for the cleaner slides. Should be the clearer and only basis for monetary policy. So that's why like they have 4% plus minus 2 as a target, the target band, and at that time when the committee came in, inflation was quite high, that was around the 10%. So they asked to shift from 10% to 6%. And they also said that RBI should adopt a flexible inflation targeting policy, and that was given with respect to the tolerance band that have. And also like they said that monetary policy should be reviewed at a bi-monthly intervals instead of quarterly intervals. Before that there was this quarterly intervention, and that too was like there wasn't any specific mandate to do it, but with the recommendations they advocated for a mandate for it, which was a landmark shift in the inflation management. And also RBI, they advocated for the introduction of spectrum of long-term repo operations to manage the liquidity. I'll be discussing this long-term operations today itself. Then also it talked about the fiscal policies, and most important thing with respect to it, it is formation of a monetary policy framework and formation of monetary policy committee. So on the basis of these recommendations, there came into picture the most significant committee, the most significant development with respect to the monetary policy is the formation of monetary policy committee. So it was focused on the Urjit Patel committee recommendation, whereby inflation targeting was the focus, and to ensure that there is a transparency and accountability in the monetary policy framework and management. And also it wanted to have views of both government and RBI to ensure that there is a equal saying and consensus based decision making. However, though we will discuss that actually the decisions are taken by the voting, and RBI governors has a casting vote in case of tie, but the members appointed by government and members appointed by RBI both are there, and it gives in an excellent way to have a wider perspective and diverse views on the monetary policy. Why? Because there is this monetary policy dilemma which we talked about in the last session, whereby like the competing views of growth versus inflation were there, and we would know that like RBI wants to curtail the inflation, whereas at the same time government wants to push for the growth. So the diverse views, diverse perspective become quite progressive to have that in the structural framework. It also reduces pressure on RBI governor in policy decisions. Why? Because he is aided, not really aided, but he is actually a part of the larger monetary policy committee rather than him being the sole guide to the him being sole guide to the monetary policy decisions in India. And most important thing was, since the both government and the RBI are there, there can be synergy and coordination between the monetary policy, which is like the how to control the monetary framework in India, and there is a fiscal policy about the budgeting, about the government expenditure, and so on. So this coordination can actually have make our economy systematized in a way of handling the dilemma between growth and inflation excellently. The monetary policy actually has a total number of 6 members, out of which 3 are from RBI, and 3 external members are nominated by Government of India on the recommendations of a committee headed by Cabinet Secretary, and they are appointed for the term of 4 years, and they are not eligible for the reappointment. Another thing I want you to know is Monetary Policy Committee is a statutory body, and it gets its legal authority from the RBI Act of 1934. External members nominated by the Government of India, and uh, in actuality each member has one vote, whereas like the RBI governor has a casting vote. So RBI governor has a casting vote in case of tie, but he doesn't have a veto. Also, all decisions are taken by the majority voting, and in case of tie, RBI as a governor has a casting vote, and minutes of meeting of the monetary policy committee are published after 14 days. And also member can express their views in written statements to improve, like there is a transparency and there is a accountability. It also mandates that MPC should meet at least 4 times a year, but in present status, in reality, in current status, they meet 6 times a year. So once in 2 months, they actually do it. So, and the basis for the monetary policy committee is monetary policy framework agreement, which was signed between the Government of India and the RBI, and it amended the RBI Act 1934 into 200 in 2016 to give effect to and a legal backing to the monetary policy framework that exists in India. The primary basis, so the monetary policy status in India is currently, like I've talked about, single objective, which is like the inflation targeting, single target, which is managing inflation between 4 plus minus 2, and then single instrument, which is controlling the repo rate, nothing else. So it's the primary objective is the price stability, while keeping in mind the economic growth, and this is known as flexible inflation targeting between the 4 plus minus 2 percentage of the tolerance. Then inflation target is decided by the government in consultation with RBI once every 5 years, and role of a monetary policy committee is to fix the policy rates, fix policy rates to actually maintain the inflation in this band. And also a policy rate is defined in the RBI Act, means repo rate. So the policy rates actually in the RBI Act, they are repo rate. uh, Repo rate to achieve the target, here policy rate to report to achieve the target. RBI also should publish the monetary policy report explaining the sources of inflation and inflation forecast. And in, let's say, for the 3 consecutive quarters, if RBI fails to maintain the inflation in 4 plus minus 2 bandwidth, then it should submit a report to the government explaining the reasons for failure, actions that are being taken, and time period required to achieve the target again. uh, uh, and the one of the most important aspect of it is, it enhances the credibility of government and RBI's commitment towards the inflation control. It also streamlines the entire monetary policy transmission, monetary policy commitments, monetary policy frameworks, because the confusion is done away. Now we only need to look for the CPI combined, we only need to look for the repo rates, and we only need to look for the inflations. These are the only things that we need to look for when we are about to herald into the monetary policy discussions. And it actually like reduces the complexity of the complex systems that Indian economy or any economy is. And also it brings in the accountability of central bank. Why? Because there are reports that they need to give. There are ways to there are reports, there are ways to explain the measures. Then also that, like, they need to give out what they have did and what they hadn't, like here reasons for failure, remedial measures. Then if then there is a monetary policy report which RBI must give in to talk about sources of inflation and inflation forecast in next 6 to 18 months. And also like it reduces this scope of political pressure on central banks to make decisions regarding the interest rate. Why? Because the government and politics of the country wants the interest rate to be low because it promotes the growth, it promotes the cheaper credit, it promotes the demand. However, it comes with like pent up demand, and it may lead to hottening of the economy, it may lead to the inflation and so on. But for the larger macroeconomic stability, there must be a suitable commitment of the government towards the developmental measures and suitable commitment of the central bank towards the like growth targets. So both of these coming on the same platform, discussing and deliberating, having a backing of the legal aspect and having a framework within the RBI Act ensures that there is a great synergy, great team spirit between the two. Uh, However, the uh, the experts or the critics of the monetary policy committee argue that single objective, single focus, single target perspective may lead to compromising on the cases of the employment, cases on the economic growth, cases on the forex management and so on. Because like the money is also related to employment, money is also related to economic growth, and money also related to forex management. So that can be the question. Also, like I have told you, the monetary policy committee and monetary policy framework doesn't make much of a sense when there is a when there is a inflation which is supply side. Inflation is supply side, and when the inflation is actually what, it's imported. So in that case, if the overall effectivity of the monetary policy comes into question. And also excessive focus on inflation may lead to reduced demand, may lead to like reduced economic growth, may lead to increase in cost of credit, and thus a decrease in purchasing power, and so on. I mean, so all of these discussions, all of these give and take, which are which have we talked about a lot till now, and also which is like central theme in the monetary policy dilemma, are persistent. But the major and foremost thing that actually is a challenge for the monetary policy committee and entire monetary policy framework in India is this thing: the supply side inflation, the fragmented supply chains. So like take the case of agriculture markets. Agriculture markets in India are quite fragmented, and they are often like divided into various states driven by the APMC markets that existed. So in that case, and lack of like a national supply chain driven by a national market uh, leads to significant cases of food inflation, particularly the vegetable, protein, and the dairy inflation that actually hamper the common man. And again, the case of imported inflation. So there is a like data that if the oil increases by $10 per barrel, the CPI in India increases by like close to 0.64. So this CPI of 0.64, you can understand now with the wars going on, with the uh, Middle East like facing the heat of the war, and then oil reserves and the gas reserves feast, facing the heat from the attacks of the drones. The imported inflation is set to become major challenge in the next few months to come if the war doesn't like get handled and negotiated well. Why I'm discussing this? Because the monetary policy and relationship of it with the inflation has been asked two times in mains, like I have talked to you. And for that, you need to know this nuance of the imported and supply side inflation. Normally, what would do? You would know that हाँ RBI कर सकता है क्या मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी से, हाँ RBI कर सकता है. कैसे करेगा? रेपो रेट कम करो, बैंक रेट, रेपो रेट बढ़ाओ, बैंक रेट बढ़ाओ, रिजर्व रेपो बढ़ाओ, एलएफ महंगा करो. वो सब कुछ तो पता ही है, पर बात क्या है कि यू आर नॉट गिविंग इन द एक्चुअल पिक्चर. तुम एक्चुअल चीज तो उसको बता ही नहीं रहे, जो चल रहा है वो तुमको उसको बता ही नहीं रहे. चल क्या रहा है कि सप्लाई साइड फ्रैगमेंटेड मार्केट्स है, फ्रैगमेंटेड सप्लाई चेन्स है, दी प्राइस डिस्कवरी पुअर है, एंड ऑल्सो इंपोर्टेड इन्फ्लेशन है. तो इन दो केसेस में क्वेश्चन ऑफ मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी मैनेजमेंट, क्वेश्चन ऑफ मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी फ्रेमवर्क मतलब बहुत ही चैलेंजिंग है. तो आई होप लाइक दिस इज क्लियर फॉर यू. तो कंक्लूजन क्या है कि भैया हमारे पास ना इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग जो है वो सप्लाई साइड रहता है, एंड केवल मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी से सॉल्व नहीं हो सकता है. यू नीड टू फोकस ऑन द सप्लाई साइड थिंग्स. यू नीड टू इंप्रूव द मार्केट डिस्कवरी markets. You need to improve the supply chains. You need to have the measures like the Essential Commodities Act to ensure that like there is no hoarding, there is no profiteering by creating artificial scarcity. तो इंडिया में क्या है ना कि इंडिया में जो फ्लेक्सिबल इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग करी है इंस्टेड ऑफ स्ट्रिक्ट इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग, विच इज एक्चुअली गुड थिंग, क्योंकि हमने +-2% का टॉलरेंस ऑलरेडी दिया हुआ है, एंड दैट टू फॉर द 3 क्वार्टर्स. एक दो क्वार्टर में तो चलता भी है. तो इस केस में इंडियाज अप्रोच सीम्स टू बी क्वाइट द गुड in paper, in principle, in the like theory, but the practicality is like cause of concern with the imported inflation and with the supply side factors. Moving forward, we'll be talking about like the what are instruments of monetary policy management, or the how does the money supply management. So before moving that, I want you to understand the concept of discounting. So what does discounting means? So let's say there is something called as bill of exchange. What is bill of exchange? Bill of exchange is a written document that assures payment of money by purchaser to the seller for a goods purchased or the services delivered at a future date. So what it is, फिर से एक बार बताता हूँ. ये एक written document है given by the uh, uh, buyer to the seller in exchange of goods and services that they purchased. एंड इस रिटर्न डॉक्यूमेंट में क्या क्या रहेगी थी? इस रिटर्न डॉक्यूमेंट में देयर इज अ कमिटमेंट एंड ऑब्लिगेशन टू गिव मनी एट फ्यूचर प्राइस. सो लेट्स से हम लोग एनएफयू में हैं और तुम लोग कौन है? तुम लोग है हमारा बायर. तो तुम लोग को एनएफयू से चाहिए एक मस्त करारी करारी सी थार. तो तुम मेरे पास आए, तुमने मेरे को बोला कि निखिल भाई एक काम करिए, मेरे को थार चाहिए, आप दीजिए. तो फिर मैंने तुम्हें थार दे दी. तुम्हारे पास में अभी पैसा नहीं था. तुमने क्या बोला कि ये आप मेरे से बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज ले लो, कि जिसमें मैं आपको, आज क्या है, आज तारीख जो जो भी मतलब 10 मार्च है, तो मैं आपको 31 मार्च को इसके जो भी 18 लाख बनेंगे, 20 लाख बनेंगे, वो आपको दूंगा. तो फिर अब ये बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज बनाएगा. तो अब इस बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज पे अब एनएफयू के पास आए आप, तो एनएफयू के पास में क्या है? एनएफयू ने तो थार तो दे दी, पर एनएफयू के पास में अब 31 मार्च को मैच्योर होने वाला 20 लाख रुपए का एक बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज है. पर अब क्या हुआ कि आ गई तारीख 20 ऑफ मार्च. अब 20 ऑफ मार्च को एनएफयू में नमन को देना है एक मस्त सा आईफोन. तो नमन क्या बोलेगा कि नमन को चाहिए 2 लाख रुपए. तो नमन को पर 20 तारीख को ही लेना है. तो नमन क्या बोलेगा कि भैया मेरे पास में 31 मार्च का तो बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज है, पर मैं 11 दिन नहीं रुक सकता, मेरे को आज ही पैसा चाहिए. तो नमन क्या करेगा? ये बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज लेके किसी के पास जाएगा, फिर वहां पे उस बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज को डिस्काउंट करेगा. सो डिस्काउंटिंग इज व्हाट? डिस्काउंटिंग इज कन्वर्जन ऑफ मनी, बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज टू द मनी एट अ डेट अर्लियर देन मेंशन्ड. तो क्या होता है कि नमन जो 20 लाख रुपए का मिलने वाला था, कितने 31 मार्च को, नमन 20 तारीख को ही वो एक एजेंट के पास जाता है या फिर किसी बैंक के पास जाता है. अब लेट्स से बैंक के पास ही जाता है, बैंक को बोलता है कि मेरे पास में 31 मार्च का 20 लाख रुपए का बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज है, पर मुझे आज ही पैसा चाहिए क्योंकि मुझे 2 लाख रुपए का आईफोन लेना है. आप मेरे से बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज दे दो और मेरे को एक आपसे कुछ वो ले लो, मेरे को अभी पैसा दे दो. तो बैंक क्या करेगी? बैंक नमन से वो बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज लेगी 31 मार्च का 20 लाख रुपए का, और नमन को 20 तारीख को ही उसके 19 लाख रुपए देगी. वाई? बिकॉज उसने डिस्काउंट किया, उसको ये 11 दिन एक्स्ट्रा वो बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज उसके पास रखना पड़ेगा ना. तो दिस प्रोसेस ऑफ गिविंग लेसर अमाउंट ऑफ मनी, तो 20 लाख के बदले उसको 19 लाख दिया, तो फिर कितना? 1 लाख रुपए का डिस्काउंट मिला, जो कि कितना है? 1 लाख अपॉन 20 लाख, 5% का डिस्काउंट मिला. तो फिर 5% जो बना वो डिस्काउंटिंग रेट बना. और डिस्काउंटिंग इज अ प्रोसेस कि जब ये बिल को ये जो ये रहता है, क्या बोलते हैं उसको, बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज, उसको अर्लियर डेट पे मनी पे कन्वर्ट करना. तो जनरली क्या होता है कि बैंक्स रहते हैं, बैंक्स दे हैव सच बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज, दे हैव सर्टेन सिक्योरिटीज, और वो सब कुछ है. अब नमन ने तो आईसीआईसी को पैसे दिए थे क्योंकि उसने उसको आईफोन लेना था, तो फिर उसने उसका बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज डिस्काउंट करवाया. अब क्या हुआ कि आरबीआई को भी 25 मार्च को किसी को लैंडिंग करनी थी, तो फिर उसके पास में उसको लैंडिंग करनी थी 20 लाख रुपए की, उसके पास में थे अभी 50,000 रुपए ही. तो फिर व्हाट दे वांटेड टू डू? दे वांटेड टू अरेंज 9.5 लाख फ्रॉम समवेयर. तो 19.5 लाख फ्रॉम देयर. सो व्हाट दे डू इज बैंक्स, आईसीआईसीआई गोज टू आरबीआई एंड आस्क देम फॉर द 19.5 लाख. तो आरबीआई बोलती है कि जो शुरुआत में जो बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज था वो आप मेरे को दे दो, मैं 31 मार्च को उसका 20 लाख रुपया करूंगा, पर मैं अभी आपको उसको डिस्काउंट 19.5% पे ही कर सकता हूं. तो फिर 5% अपॉन 19.5 इंटू 100 ये जो बनता है 0.5 इंटू मतलब जो है, तो यही अपना डिस्काउंटिंग रेट है. तो बैंक रेट वो होता है कि रेट एट विच आरबीआई डिस्काउंट्स फर्स्ट क्लास बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज. अब फर्स्ट क्लास मतलब कौन सी? भाई जो सबसे अच्छे, मतलब अब कोई एक बंदा है भाई जो खुद जिसके पास में खुद के पास ही पैसे नहीं है, अब वो किसी को उधारी से पैसे लेता है और उसको बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज लेता है. तो फिर अब 31 मार्च पे वो उसका बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज एनकैश होगा, इसकी कोई कम गारंटी है. पर अगर वही कोई बड़ा आदमी है, जैसे एनएफयू है, एनएफयू ने कोई बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज दिया तो फिर एनएफयू का बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज ट्रस्टवर्दी रहेगा, तो फिर फर्स्ट क्लास में माना जाएगा। तो जनरली ये जो बैंक रेट रहता है ना, कि जिस रेट एट विच बैंक्स आरबीआई डिस्काउंट्स फर्स्ट क्लास बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज फ्रॉम बैंक्स इज कॉल्ड एज बैंक रेट. I hope like this concept of discounting is clear for you, because why? This discounting rate and this bank rate actually handles the entire monetary policy money supply. Of course all instruments are there, but अगर आपको discounting वाला फंडा पता चल गया तो फिर आगे के concept जैसे जी सेक्स है, ट्री बिल्स है, रेपो ऑपरेशंस है, सारे ऑपरेशंस आपको इजी लगेंगे. Let me explain it one more time. The bill of exchange is actually a written document that assures payment of money by purchaser to the seller for the goods purchased, and that actually like the done at a future date. Discounting is a process that converts this bill of exchange in the money earlier than mentioned on the bill of exchange, and all of this happens, discounting happens at a rate whereby the conversion of money takes place at lesser value than of the bill of exchange. And बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज की जो वैल्यू है एंड एक्चुअल वैल्यू जो मिलती है कन्वर्जन ऑफ मनी में, वो डिस्काउंटिंग रेट कहलाता है. एंड व्हाट हैपेंस व्हेन देयर इज अ बायर, then it gives bill of exchange to the seller, then seller goes to this bank and bank goes to this RBI. So the rate at which RBI discounts banks bill of exchange, which are of the first class, is actually called as bank rate. And since what happens, banks get money by discounting bills of exchange, and these money is actually used for lending, these money is actually used for creating demand, these money is used for the credit creation. If let's say what happens, बैंक के पास में अभी एक बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज है जो कि 1000 रुपए का है, वो आरबीआई के पास गया, आरबीआई उसको बोली कि ये बिल ऑफ एक्सचेंज जो है मैं अभी उसके 900 रुपया दूंगा, मतलब जो भी है, तो उसके पास में एक्चुअल में 900 रुपया ही आया, तो फिर अब वो 900 में से लेट्स से 800 रुपया ही लेंड कर सकता है. बट व्हाट हैपेंस, सो अभी डिस्काउंटिंग कितना हुआ, ग्रेटर देन 10% का हुआ, और लेट्स से 10% का हुआ. बट व्हाट विल हैपन, आरबीआई बोले कि रादर देन 900 रुपीज दूंगी, मैं तुम्हें 950 रुपीज दूंगी, तो फिर बैंक्स वुड हैव इंस्टेंट ऑफ मेकिंग 800 रुपीज एज अ लैंड, दे विल गिव ग्रेटर देन 800 रुपीज, लेट्स से 870 रुपीज देगा वो. तो ये 870 रुपीज जो है ना, तो फिर अब 70 रुपए से मनी फ्लो बढ़ाना है एक अपनी ओवरऑल इकोनॉमी में, अपनी ओवरऑल मनी एग्रीगेट्स में. सो दिस 80 रुपीज इंक्रीज जो है ना, वो एक्चुअल में इंक्रीज इन मनी सप्लाई है, एक्चुअल में इंक्रीज इन परचेसिंग पावर है. सो दैट्स व्हाई लाइक द हायर बैंक रेट्स would mean that there is a larger discounting, and lower bank rates means there is a lower discounting. So lower discounting means higher money supply. I hope like this is clear for you. उसी के बाद में अब इसी बेसिस पे मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी चलती है. कैसे कि हाउस होल्ड्स है, कॉर्पोरेट्स है, इंस्टेड ऑफ बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज नाउ दे हैव द मनी, एंड व्हाट दे डू इज दे टेक दिस मनी एंड दे डिपॉजिट इट विद बैंक्स. So banks, what they would do, either they would deposit it with RBI for SLR, for CRR, for the other swaps and other things, and also they will take loans from the RBI via repo operations, via the LAF operations, via the MSF operations, to meet their liquidity needs, to meet like their assets and balance sheets and so on. तो बैंक्स क्या करेंगे कि अब इन लोन्स को लेके, इन डिपॉजिट्स को लेके लेंड करेंगे, किनको, आरबीआई को लेंड करेंगे, और हाउस होल्ड और कंज्यूमर को लेंड करेंगे. हाउस होल्ड और कंज्यूमर को लेंड करने का रेट जितना कम रहेगा, उतना ही चीपर क्रेडिट रहेगा, उतना ही मोर अवेलेबिलिटी ऑफ क्रेडिट रहेगा, उतना ही इंक्रीज मनी सप्लाई रहेगा. तो रेट ऑफ डिपॉजिट्स जो रहते हैं या फिर रेट ऑफ लेंडिंग जो रहते हैं, इसी से कॉस्ट ऑफ लेंडिंग एंड बोरोइंग डिसाइड होता है, इसी से मनी सप्लाई वैरी होता है, इसी से एग्रीगेट डिमांड वैरी होती है, इसी से इन्फ्लेशन वैरी होता है. सो दैट इज द एंटायर प्रोसेस ऑफ मनी सप्लाई. मतलब पहले भी हम लोग ये बहुत बार डिस्कस कर चुके हैं, जस्ट आई वांटेड टू पुट इन कि कैसे होता है फिर से एक बारी। तो ये मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी कंट्रोल करने के या फिर ये कंट्रोल करने के दो तरीके हैं। RBI does it with the help of quantitative measures and with the help of qualitative measures. Quantitative measures का मतलब क्या है कि ये ओवरऑल फ्लो एंड वॉल्यूम ऑफ द मनी रेगुलेट करते हैं। हियर quantitative measures do quantitative measures do not discriminate between the do not discriminate between the sectors। तो अगर क्वांटिटेटिव मेजर से अगर हम लोगों ने मनी सप्लाई बढ़ाया तो फिर अक्रॉस द इकोनॉमी मनी सप्लाई बढ़ेगा, हम लोगों ने कम किया तो फिर अक्रॉस द इकोनॉमी कम करेगा। पर वही क्वालिटेटिव जो रहता है ना वो सिलेक्टिव रेट रहता है, इससे स्पेसिफिक सेक्टर्स पे मनी सप्लाई बढ़ेगा, स्पेसिफिक सेक्टर्स पे मनी सप्लाई कम होगा। वो कैसे करेगा? आरबीआई बोलेगी कि भैया सोलर हाउस होल्ड सोलर पावर प्लांट्स के लिए ही जो लोन दिए जाएंगे उसी पर एक क्रेडिट इंटरेस्ट जो है वो कम करना है तुमको, उसी पे आपको लेंडिंग बढ़ानी है, ऐसा बैंक्स को बोलेगी। सिमिलर इज द केस विद प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग। बैंक्स बोलेगी कि आपको 6 7 8 सेक्टर जो भी है उन पे आपको लेंडिंग बढ़ानी है, तो फिर अगर आप उस पे लेंडिंग नहीं बढ़ाओगे तो फिर आपको ये पेनल्टी देना पड़ेगा। तो उस केस में एक स्पेसिफिक क्वालिटेटिव बेस्ड मेजर्स लिए जाते हैं मनी सप्लाई बढ़ाने फिर कम करने के लिए। तो ये क्वालिटेटिव मेजर्स है और एक क्वांटिटेटिव मेजर्स है। एंड जनरली both of these things are driven by RBI. Why? Because RBI is the controller of credit in India. Controller of credit. When we'll discuss RBI, हम सारे functions उसके देख लेंगे, but it actually controls the money supply, it controls the lending, it controls the borrowing, and it so does by various like qualitative and quantitative measures. फिर उसमें भी कुछ कन्वेंशनल मेजर्स है, कुछ अनकन्वेंशनल मेजर्स है ये क्वांटिटेटिव में। कन्वेंशनल मेजर्स क्या है कि वो है बैंक रेट, ओपन मार्केट ऑपरेशंस, वेरिएबल रिजर्व रेशियोज जो सीआरआर एसएलआर है। फिर अनकन्वेंशनल में तो हमने देखा ही था कि क्वांटिटेटिव ईजिंग थी, मार्जिनल स्टैंडिंग फैसिलिटी थी, मार्केट सप्लाई स्कीम थी एंड सो ऑन। अब ये बात क्या है कि हर एक इंस्ट्रूमेंट काम वैसे ही करता है, बस आपको थोड़े मोड़े डिटेल्स पता हो कि कैसे उनकी डिटेल्स है। Here I'll be trying to give you concept aspect of it, and जब कुछ पीओ नोट्स टाइप देना रहेगा तो फिर मैं इनके स्पेसिफिक टेबल्स वगैरह भी तुमको दे ही दूंगा। अभी बस उसका प्रोसेस, उसका अंडरस्टैंडिंग, उसका लिंकेजेस समझो क्योंकि वो बहुत जरूरी है। लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द क्वांटिटेटिव मेजर्स एंड लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द व्हाट यू कैन से द कन्वेंशनल मेजर्स। कन्वेंशनल में हम लोगों ने सबसे पहले तो बैंक रेट तो हमने देख लिया कि कैसे बैंक रेट से होता है, ये यहाँ पे मैं वो डिस्कस कर चुका हूँ कि बिल्स ऑफ एक्सचेंज जब डिस्काउंटिंग होती है तो उस हिसाब से अगर लोअर डिस्काउंटिंग रेट है तो फिर हायर मनी सप्लाई रहेगा, अगर हायर बैंक रेट है, हायर रेट ऑफ डिस्काउंट है तो फिर कम बैंक सप्लाई रहेगा। तो उसी में देयर इज समथिंग कॉल्ड एज the CRR and SLRs, which are often called as variable supply, यहाँ पे मैंने लिखा है, they are called as variable reserve ratios। तो उसमें one is CRR which is also called as like the cash reserve ratio। तो ये क्या है? It is the percentage of total deposits, they may be like the net demand and time liabilities which banks have to keep with RBI in cash at any point of time. Also like I think by slip of tongue मैंने सेशन 1 में ये कहा था कि CRR जो रहता है वो बैंक्स को उनके खुद के पास में रखना पड़ता है, तो फिर वो मेरे से स्लिप ऑफ टंग था, वो मिस्टेक था। Banks need to keep the cash reserves with RBI, and also it's part of the like it's some part of their net demand and time liabilities। Most importantly like earlier there was a ceiling on कि इसी फिक्स बैंक के बीच में CRR और SLR होना चाहिए था, पर अभी वो है नहीं। In 2006 with the RBI amendment, the ceiling has been removed away. So CRR actually is the cash reserve upon the net time and demand liability. So it is what it's the uh, total percentage of the net time and demand deposits that uh, banks have to keep with the RBI in the form of cash, and it's particularly done to protect them from lending excessively, to ensure that like banks have a certain reserve of cash in case like the deposit too much of a withdrawal from the deposit takes into them. Also it protects them from being in a position whereby there is a scarcity of liquidity and so on. I mean it's way by which they actually control the entire monetary policy in the economy, and also the stability, the liquidity, the risk assessment, the balance sheet of the banks as well. Yeah. So what happens if, let's say, there are 100 rupees of deposits with the I'll like use the other one so that my handouts are cleaner for you. So if, let's say, there is 100 rupees deposits, NDTL, net demand and type liabilities with the bank, which are like the deposits with bank. So what they want to do, they want to monetize it, and they want to earn interest from the assets. So what they would do, they would want to lend part of it. अब लेट्स से CRR अगर 10% का है, तो फिर they can only lend 90 rupees. Why? Because 10 rupees, 10% of the 100, which is 10 rupees, have to keep them with the RBI for the like the liquidity purpose, the cash reserve purpose, and they can only lend the 90 rupees. In other case, when let's say the CRR is, let's say, 5%, then what they would do, CRR come hua, so they would have to only give 5 rupees with the RBI, and they can actually lend 95 rupees. तो ये जो तो अब क्या हुआ कि 90 से 95 क्या हुआ कि 5 रुपीस का जो लेंडिंग पावर है वो बैंक्स का बढ़ा, फिर 5 रुपए से क्रेडिट भी बढ़ा, तो फिर बैंक्स वुड हैव लार्जर रिसोर्सेस एट देयर डिस्पोजल. तो फिर जो पहले जो केवल बेस्ट ऑफ द बेस्ट को ही वो लेंडिंग कर रहे थे, अब वो थोड़ा सा कम सेफ वाले को भी लेंडिंग करेंगे. So what it does, CRR, with the CRR increase, credit creation capacity of the banks decreases, money multiplier decreases, money supply decreases. So it results in decrease in aggregate demand, price level, and economic growth. Also profitability of the banks decreases with CRR increase. Why? Because जैसे CRR के ऊपर there is CRR में उनको बैंक्स के पास में कैश ही रखना पड़ेगा, तो फिर उस इसके ऊपर उनको कुछ इंटरेस्ट नहीं मिलता है. Banks don't get that interest on any part of cash reserve that they keep with RBI. But if the same amount of money, if they would have been lending, then they would get interest for it, they would get income from it. So with increase in CRR, the profitability of the banks also decreases. Then additionally there is a SLR also. It's a percentage of total uh, 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 demand and time liabilities which bank have to maintain with themselves. Again, it's with themselves and in the form of special liquid assets. So फिर अभी liquid assets, it can be cash, G-Secs and gold, so that like they are in a good commanding position in terms of their balance sheets, and also it prevents banks from lending all of its deposit and also being in a too risky position, so that like I mean their overall health, their overall financial health is protected. Also these assets must not be placed against any loans, and gold is generally kept at a historic price. अब ऐसे नहीं है कि भैया 2 लाख रुपए का प्राइस अभी चल रहा है तो फिर मैंने जब गोल्ड एसएलआर रखा था तो फिर वो 60,000 रुपए से चल रहा है, तो फिर अब मैं क्या 1/3 ऑफ द गोल्ड बेच दूं क्या? अभी वैसे नहीं रहता, एक डेट फिक्स करते हैं, उसी पे गोल्ड का प्राइस करते हैं, फिर उस हिसाब से वॉल्यूम ऑफ गोल्ड फिक्स करना पड़ता है. अगेन एसएलआर का अभी कोई लिमिट नहीं है. अभी इट it can be between like 0 to 40, and then the any ceiling for it has been like done away. Also the SLR is often like kept with themselves in the form of cash, gold, and government, and when the value is calculated, sum total of all of it is calculated. The main objective is to maintain that banks are liquid, uh, to compel banks to lend to the government. Why? Because like with SLR, they can keep GSEX as their security, GSEX as a part of their SLR requirement. So to have a SLR mandate for them, they can actually like buy the securities of the government. And also it ensures that like there is a secondary market for the government securities, क्योंकि बहुत बारी क्या रहता है कि if let's say there is a bank A which has SLR requirement of 19%, then there is bank B जिसके पास में भी सेम मतलब 19% का या फिर 20% 20% का SLR रिक्वायरमेंट है. अब क्या हुआ कि इस बैंक ने अब आज के लिए तो लेंड कर दिया, तो फिर अब उस इसके कमेंसुरेट उसकी जो नेट डिमांड है या फिर इसके पास में डिपॉजिट्स है लेट्स से, और वो लेंड करना चाहता है, तो फिर अब ये डिपॉजिट्स के अकॉर्डिंग उसको अब कुछ एसएलआर रखना पड़ेगा. तो ये जो एसएलआर रखता है, तो फिर अब इमीडिएटली वो कहां से गोल्ड लाएगा, फिर इमीडिएटली कहां से कैश करेगा, क्योंकि उसको लेंडिंग भी करनी है. तो फिर व्हाट इट डज, बैंक बी के पास में एक्सेस ऑफ गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज है, तो ए बी के पास में जाता है, एक्सेस ऑफ गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज बैंक से खरीदता है और अपनी एसएलआर रिक्वायरमेंट पूरी करता है. तो दिस इज वन ऑफ द वे, लाइक सीआरआर में CRR were more of these stringent measures, but SLR में other factors भी है कि जैसे कि liquidity maintain करना, secondary bond market बनाना, and most importantly credit control करना. कैसे? With increase in SLR, credit creation capacity of the banks would be decreasing, money supply would be decreasing, price levels decreasing, and economic growth also would be decreasing. Why? Because there would be lower credit creation. अब तुम बैंक्स की ही जीसेक्स खरीदने के लिए जाओगे तो फिर अगेन वो मॉरल हजार्ड बनेगा ना. तो इस चीज की वजह से इकोनॉमिक हायर एसएलआर इज नॉट गुड फॉर एनीवन. It only is should be maintained to the level that the safety, the security, the financial capacity of the banks are in a healthy and good levels. एंड अब कैसे एसएलआर बढ़ाने से क्रेडिट क्रिएशन कम होता है, वो एसएलआर वो सीआरआर वाले फंडे की तरह ही है कि 15% रखना है 100 में से, तो फिर पहले 85 रुपीज लेंड कर सकता था, पर अब देखो सीआरआर 85 15% से लेकर के 20% बना दिया, तो फिर अब वो 80 रुपीज ही लेंड कर पाएगा, तो फिर अब क्रेडिट क्रिएशन भी कम होगा, फिर मनी मल्टीप्लायर भी कम होगा, एग्रीगेट डिमांड भी कम होगी. I hope like this is you are able to understand this. And again same thing कि बैंक की प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी कम रहेगी, क्योंकि उसको या तो गोल्ड में रखना पड़ेगा, या तो फिर उसको कैश में रखना पड़ेगा, या तो फिर उसको गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज में रखना पड़ेगा. जीसेक जो रहती है वो 6-7% की यील्ड देती है, और अगर वो तुम्हें और मुझे व्हीकल लोन देगा, तुम्हें और मेरे को हाउस लोन देगा, तो फिर 9% 9.5% से रहेगा. तो फिर 2% का जो स्प्रेड मिस आउट होता है उससे प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी भी कम होती है. बट इसका इंपैक्ट कम रहता है सीआरआर के मुकाबले, क्योंकि एसएलआर कुछ तो इनकम अर्न करती है फ्रॉम द गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज, बट सीआरआर के केस में देयर इज नो सच इनकम फ्रॉम द रिजर्व्स व्हिच आर केप्ट in addition to the CRR and SLR, which are like the variable reserve ratios, there are certain typical processes called as open market operations by RBI. So what it is, these are the operations whereby central government, which is like the central bank, which is the RBI, buys and sell government securities in the financial markets to influence the money supply and overall like the aggregate demand in the economy. So it is generally done through the auctions. And how it functions is very simple. Like if RBI, there is this RBI, and then like there is this institution. If RBI, let's say, buys the securities from them, RBI actually gives them the money, and with that money the institutions can actually create credit, they increase the money supply, they increase the demand, and so on. So when there is a sluggish growth, when there is a lower growth, when there's a lower demand, generally what does RBI do is RBI buys the securities from the market to increase the money supply. On the contrary, when there is a higher inflation, RBI wants to reduce the money supply in the economy, so does RBI sells them the government securities to suck out the money supply and overall liquidity in the market. And it is generally done through the auction. How it is done? If let's say RBI wants to sell a bond of, let's say, 100 rupees face value, then what does RBI would do? RBI would give in the auction, and in auction, like, different players would actually bid for it, and the highest bidder would get the security, which is of, let's say, 95 rupees, which is the PNB. And that's how it works. So bond price is 95 rupees, and then interest yield would be like 5 uh, interest yield would be the 5%, because it's 100 के ऊपर 5 रुपए का yield मिल रहा है. And we have discussed about how bond prices impact the interest rate, and how interest rate actually like impact the overall yield. That this thing we have discussed in a great detail. Additional In addition to this, like, there are bank rates as well. It is a rate at which the central bank lends money to the commercial banks against the approved securities, and generally it has been given as like the repo rate plus like some 25 to 100 bps, like basis point above the repo rate. And we'll be discussing about what the repo rate is and what it is, but like, bank rate is this rate uh, uh, at which banks actually can borrow money from the RBI, and by varying the bank rate, RBI controls the credit. So if let's say RBI offer discount rate at higher rate, which is the increase whereby like the increase the bank rate, the bank's profit may be affected. So it will not approach RBI for the discounting, or will charge higher discount rate from the customer from the lending that they do. So if let's say like this is bank, and they want to raise funds, so what they will do, they will either borrow from the RBI, or like they will borrow from the uh, people or other households. So if let's say they borrow from RBI at 5%, then they can give that 5% borrowed funds at the 7% to have 2% of spread. However, if let's say they borrow from RBI at 6%, then the 1% spread would be left for them. So their profitability actually decreases. So what happens? Either they would have to increase the lending rate. So increasing lending rate makes borrowing costlier. So this reduces the demand, reduces the overall credit generation, and overall controls the overall the money supply in the economy. So in that case, the customer may not discount the bill, or customer may not take the credit. So depending upon the economic condition, depending upon what macroeconomic policy measures are, depending upon whatever inflation rates are, RBI alters the bank rates. So in case of like higher inflation, RBI prefers to have the higher inflation rate to reduce the lending capacity, to reduce the credit creation. So the bank rate increases, borrowing from the RBI becomes costly, money supply decreases. Similar is the case with bank rate decreases, borrowing becomes cheaper, and money supply increases. However, in current days, this bank rate has become quite the old phenomenon, and we don't have them at the present date. And like I have discussed earlier, so here itself, whereby the bank rates are rate at which RBI discounts the first class bills of exchange. So let me tell you, like, what do I mean by when I say like these are the first class securities? These are corporate securities against which banks can borrow from RBI. Generally, they are commercial paper, commercial bills, and they are issued at a discount. So what do they mean at at a discount? Person uh, doesn't earn interest, rather they are like they have zero interest coupon. So you don't get interest, rather you are issued at a discount. So what will happen? Let's say you have a commercial paper, or you have a like bill of exchange which would mature at 31st of March, and it is of the 100 face value. And now if let's say you want to convert it to the money right now today, like on the 10th of March, then you would have to get 95 rupees of that 100 rupees. So that 5% is the discount and the processes of the discounting. And this actually like works in across the this commercial papers, commercial bills, then T bills also. When we'll discuss about the fiscal policy and government debts, they are zero interest or zero coupon securities. So example would be like, so TCS, let's say, issues commercial papers of 5 lakh rupees and they are for a 1 year. Bank buys them at a discount. So since they will mature and they will be of the value of 5 lakh rupees at the end of 1 year, but at this position they'll only have to pay 4.5 lakh rupees. This is called as discounting. Later banks can actually sell it to the RBI for, let's say, lesser discount. So they may sell to RBI at 4.7 lakh rupees, and RBI pays out like the 5 lakh rupees minus the discount and the interest. This is called as rediscounting. So first discounts were first commercial papers were discounted at the RBI, then again at the bank, and then banks are again, they are again discounted at the RBI. अब जितनी बारी होता है उतनी बारी rediscounting होती है. So if bank rates increases, money supply decreases. Why? Because rate of discounting increases. Rate of discounting increases. How what do I mean by rate of discounting increases? If let's say this 100 rupees face value bond is there and now it's being like discounted to 95 rupees, then 5% is the rate of discount. So 95 rupees will be the money supply with the bearer of these bills of exchange. But let's take a case whereby we increase this discounting rate to 8%. So this 100 rupee bond would be, rather than 92, it would be 95. It would be given to the 92. So now rather than 95 rupees of money creation, only 92 rupees of money creation would be there, and thus the 3 rupee difference in the money supply is there. So and 3 rupees reduced money supply in this case. So that's why increasing bank rate is to reduce money supply. Then there is something called as a liquidity adjustment facility. So what happens under a LAF, central bank tries to reduce the short-term fluctuations in the currency through operations called as repo and reverse repo transactions. So these are like very important and very significant aspects of any economic system. So what are repos? Repos are they are called as repurchase options, and then there is a repo rate. So first understand what repo is, what are repurchase options or operations. So repo is a process whereby central banks actually purchase short-term government securities from financial or institutions or banks with an agreement that they will buy them at a predetermined rate or date. They will buy them back at a predetermined rate. So every repurchase operation has two legs. In first leg, what RBI would do? RBI would, from the bank or from the financial institution, they will buy certain securities and infuse the cash to them. And in second leg, there is a commitment or obligation, or let's say like the agreement or option. Option means not necessarily they will have to buy it, but they may or they may not buy it, to actually like buy them back. So RBI, and then there is this bank, and then they would give them the security which was earlier there. So that is how the repurchase operation happens in. However, repo rate is a rate at which the commercial banks borrow from the RBI, and this has been the major policy rate and major segment rate that has been existing. And generally what happens, they are given in against the mortgage securities, and they are generally of the short term. What do I mean by like short term? They are generally done for the 1 day or overnight basis. So they are like done for the 1 day, there are for the 14 days, and they are generally variable rate repos. So what do I mean by variable rate? the rate at which discounting is done, rate at which discounting is done, or the rate at which the interest is actually like paid, is variable and depends upon the auction. Auction I have talked about. In addition to this, in recent times, innovative measures like the fixed rate repos have been put in by the RBI, and there are long-term repo rates, targeted long-term reports, and special LTRO, special long-term repo rates. So what happens? So the long-term repo rates uh, uh, are generally for 1 to 3 years, and though interest rate is somewhat similar to the repo rate, but the rationale behind it is injection of long term liquidity compared to what the short term liquidity which is being induced by the short term funds. This came into fore particularly in the case of demonetization, whereby there was large amount of deposits which were put in with the banks, and they needed to have some respite from the increased deposits and lower lending space that they had. Uh, so repo rate is a rate at which rate of interest at which central banks provide short-term loans to commercial banks against government securities. So if let's say there is this government bank, and then there is this there is RBI, and then there is this there is this commercial bank, and if government wants to have a loan, then they would approach RBI giving G6 as a mortgage, and then they will get money from it. And the interest rate on this transaction would be on the loan received by it would be of the repo rate, which is of the like most significant. And of course, you will be understand that increase in repo transaction, which would mean that there is an increase in money supply. However, repo rate increases means that there is a decrease in money supply. So repo transactions are increase in borrowing from the RBI. So remember, these are transactions. If let's say there's an increase in transactions of repo from the RBI, then central banks would have larger money for the liquidity, larger money for the credit creation, and so on. But the repo rate increase would mean that increase in the rate of interest at which commercial banks borrow from the RBI, and leading to reduced money supply. Uh, Additionally, like the bank rates generally, they are for the long term lending, and they are approved against the securities, and they are generally like the higher than the repo rate. So generally, like repo plus 25 to 100 bps would be the bank rate. However, repo rates are for the short term lending, they are for the government securities, and they are generally lower. Why? Because they are generally for the shorter time. So that's why the interest rates on them are also lower. So in India, repo rate is actually the policy rate, and RBI mainly signals monetary policy through this interest rate. Uh, Additionally, like there are long-term repo operations whereby like there is they are done for long-term repo operations. So they are generally done for 1 to 3 years of lending, and then they are done at a repo rate, and the main purpose is to uh, inject long term liquidity. And so these special LTROs are actually like for the small financial bank to ensure that like their mandate of 75% of the SLR is maintained in, and in that context this repo works in. Uh, then similar to repo, there is something called as reverse repo, whereby the central banks sell short-term government securities to central financial to financial institutions or the banks with the agreement or with the option to repurchase them back at the predetermined rate at a future date. So it is a rate of interest similar to that. It is a rate of interest at which the banks can keep their funds with the central banks for a short period of time under the reverse repo transaction. So what happens, uh, like in the case of repo, there is this central bank which is RBI, and then there is this commercial bank, and RBI from commercial bank would be getting the lending. So RBI would be lending to commercial bank in case of repo. However, reverse of this happens in the case of reverse repo, where RBI and there is this commercial bank. Commercial banks keep their deposits with the RBI, and so even when the reverse repo rate increases, the money supply decreases. How does that happen? So what would banks do? Banks would prefer to keep their funds with RBI. Why? Because it's absolutely of the like guilt edged. It's absolutely safe. There is a no risk of credit failure. There is a no risk of liquidity failure or anything. Banks would be getting periodic interest at the specific times, and then like it's absolutely of zero of any risk. So what they would do with increase in repo rate, their motive to keep their funds with RBI increases. So their motive to lend to others decreases, and this actually impacts greatly to the overall credit supply. So even with increase in repo rates also money supply decreases. So not only when the repo increases money supply decreases, even when the reverse repo increases money supply decreases. Why? Because it is the rate at which banks keep their funds with the RBI for the shorter term, and when reverse repo increases, the propensity or the motivation for the banks to lend to others than RBI decreases. Why? Because they feel that like RBI is the safest bet among all. It's gilt edged, so they would prefer to keep their funds with the RBI rather than lending them to the others and indulge into create credit creation, and this actually like reduces the overall money supply. Then additionally there is something called as marginal standing facility. You can call it as a part of repo operation, as a part of repo. However, its special feature is that under MSF, RBI lends money up to certain percentage of NDTL on an overnight basis. So generally it's for the overnight basis, and it's up to maximum of 2% of net demand and time liabilities. And generally it is interest rate charged on the MSF is greater than the repo rate by the 25 to 100 percentage. And marginal standing facility is generally done uh, against the mortgage of eligible securities, which can be like the state development loans, and they are generally done in the multiples of 1 crore, and it's actually done to uh, uh, adjust for the like overnight liquidity crunches, overnight uh, uh, demand for the liquidity, and ensure that like operations beyond repo are required. Additionally, there is another scheme which is called as market stabilization scheme, and under this scheme, RBI sells special type of government securities to suck out liquidity created to the forex influx. So to discuss you up a bit, to discuss with you up a bit, market stabilization scheme comes in factor when there is a large forex influx. So what will happen when there is a large forex influx? There would be rupee appreciation. Why? Because like the demand for rupee would increase, and demand for like forex would decrease because the forex influx is greatly there, and then this rupee would be appreciated. So to actually address this rupee appreciation, what government would try and do, government would actually inject rupee in the market, so that like the exports are protected. What happens with the appreciation of rupees? Exports become cost costlier and imports become cheaper. So people may try and go for the cheaper imports to protect domestic financial stability, to protect domestic economy. Rupee is injected in it. However, this injected rupee may lead to protect potential inflation if the demand is not suitably met. To have a contingency measure for this increased potential inflation, market stabilization scheme is done, whereby they suck out the additional liquidity injected by the forex influx and the rupee appreciation which was driven by it. I hope like this concept is clear for you. How does like it goes from one thing to the other thing? If you have any doubt with respect to, you can like get back to me. But फिर से एक बार मैं बताता हूँ, किसी केस में अगर जैसे फॉरेक्स इन्फ्लक्स इन्फ्लक्स होता है तो फिर उससे रुपी अप्रिसिएशन होता है। क्यों? क्योंकि रुपी की डिमांड बढ़ती है और डॉलर की डिमांड या फिर फॉरेक्स की डिमांड कम होती है, तो फिर रुपी अप्रिसिएशन होगा। अब रुपी अप्रिसिएशन होता है तो फिर उसको एड्रेस करने के लिए, क्यों? क्योंकि रुपी एड्रेस होने से एक्सपोर्ट कम होते हैं, इंपोर्ट चीपर बढ़ते हैं, तो उनको प्रोटेक्ट करने के लिए रुपी इंजेक्ट किया जाता है। अब इस इंजेक्टेड रुपी की वजह से इन्फ्लेशन ना हो, इसलिए मार्केट स्टेबलाइजेशन स्कीम आती है, which is talked about here. RBI has to pay interest to money under and to create liquidity to forex influx. Apart from that, there are certain qualitative or selective measures in which there is a discrimination and there is a distinction between various sectors of the economy to which the impetus is given for the credit creation or for the lending. One is credit rationing, so which is a sector specific. So what does central bank fixes a quota for different sectors? So they mean that like agriculture को 5% of total क्रेडिट एक्सपोजर आपको देना ही पड़ेगा, एमएसएमईज को आपको 7% देना ही पड़ेगा। अभी जैसे प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग पॉलिसी है कि जिसमें सर्टेन सेक्टर्स को विच आर लाइक द एग्रीकल्चर, एमएसएमईज, वीकर सेक्शंस, एजुकेशन, हाउसिंग, फूड प्रोसेसिंग, आपको डोमेस्टिक कमर्शियल बैंक्स मस्ट लेट 40% ऑफ देयर एडजस्टेड नेट बैंकिंग क्रेडिट। अब ये जितना भी क्रेडिट वो दे रहे हैं उसके 40% आपको इन सेक्टर्स को देना ही पड़ेगा। सिमिलर देयर आर सब टारगेट्स ऑल्सो कि एग्रीकल्चर को आपको 18% ऑफ द टोटल देना पड़ेगा, फिर उसी में भी स्मॉल एंड मार्जिनल फार्मर्स को आपको 8% देना पड़ेगा। ऑल्सो प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग टारगेट्स मेनली टारगेट सेक्टर्स विच नॉर्मली डू नॉट रिसीव adequate credit from the bank. So it's government and RBI policy to actually ensure that कि उन डेवलपमेंट बेस्ड सेक्टर, सोशल जस्टिस बेस्ड सेक्टर्स को ज्यादा से ज्यादा क्रेडिट मिले, ज्यादा से ज्यादा बेनिफिट हो। एंड बहुत बारी ऐसे होता है कि इवन दो दीज मैंडेट आर देयर बाय द आरबीआई टू हैव एक्सपोजर ऑफ देयर एडजस्टेड नेट बैंक क्रेडिट, मतलब जितना भी क्रेडिट वो दे रहे हैं उसका 40% आप डोमेस्टिक कमर्शियल बैंक को, इन प्राइवेट सेक्टर को देना है, उसके बाद भी वो दे नहीं पाते हैं, तो दे विल हैव टू बोरो बाय प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर लेंडिंग सर्टिफिकेट्स लॉन्च्ड बाय आरबीआई. So what happens, like these are the certificates, they are issued by banks to the extent of their lending to priority sector lending over and above their sector. So if let's say there is a bank and which actually gave the priority sector lending greater than their quota, so they would be, for the additional credit that they have given, they will get the private sector lending certificates and they can now sell these certificates to other banks, so to ensure that their targets are met. So this actually created excellent scheme by RBI, and so you can say that like SBI के पास में 100% 100 रुपीज का उसने लोन दिया और प्राइवेट सेक्टर कोटा उसके लिए 40 का है, उसने एक्चुअल में प्राइवेट सेक्टर लेंडिंग करी 42 रुपीज की, तो अब उसके पास में 2 रुपए एडिशनल के प्राइवेट सेक्टर लेंडिंग सर्टिफिकेट्स है। अब यस बैंक ने क्या करा कि उसके पास भी 100 रुपीज ने लोन दिए, उसके पास 40 रुपीज का कोटा है, पर उसने एक्चुअल में 20 में ही दिए, क्योंकि भाई वो अर्बन एरियाज में काम करता है, उसके पास में एक्सपोजर नहीं है, उसको नहीं पता कि कैसे देना है, मतलब जो भी रीजन थे। अब बात क्या हो गई कि उसको अभी 20 रुपए के प्राइवेट सेक्टर लेंडिंग सर्टिफिकेट लेने पड़ेंगे टू एक्चुअली लाइक एंश्योर दैट कि उसका कोटा मेट हो। फिर उसी के बाद में नेक्स्ट रहता है क्वालिटेटिव मेजर, वो है मार्जिन रिक्वायरमेंट। सो बहुत बारी आरबीआई क्या बोलेगी कि आपको 100 रुपीज का लोन एक्सपोजर सर्टेन सेगमेंट के लिए देना है, तो फिर आपको उसके लिए उससे ज्यादा कोलैटरल रखना पड़ेगा। सो एक 20% का मार्जिन रिक्वायरमेंट है। सो इफ लेट्स से समवन इज सेटिंग अप सिगरेट प्लांट, तो आरबीआई डजंट वांट more and more cigarette plants, so what they would do is they would set up rupees 20,000 ka margin requirement for them. So if let's say a bank A what they do is they actually try to lend it to the let's say ITC, and which wants to set up a cigarette plant. So if let's say they want to actually like give loan to them of rupees 1 lakh rupees, then according to the RBI there is a margin for it. There's a margin requirement for it. That margin is of the 20,000. So they would need to keep the collateral of 1.2 lakh rupees. So what that would do, that would reduce the ITC's efforts to actually generate cigarette plants. Why? Because ITC का देखिए अब कोई और मतलब ABC, CDS और कोई सिगरेट प्लांट नहीं लगा है, क्योंकि उसको पता है कि इस सेगमेंट में अगर आपको कुछ काम करना है फिर आपको एडिशनल मार्जिन देनी पड़ती है, आपके लिए क्रेडिट कॉस्टली रहता है, and so that actually reduces the overall investment in this segment. Then next is like the ceiling on credit. So RBI fixes the maximum amount of loan that can be provided by bank to an particular economic activity. So they would say that if let's say you want to set up a liquor shop, तो इसके लिए आपको मैक्सिमम बस केवल 50,000 रुपए का ही लोन मिलेगा, बाकी का अगर आपको जो लोन है वो आपको खुद से लेना पड़ेगा. Then there is a differential rate of interest. So central bank prescribe different rates of interest for different sectors. अब जैसे मैं बोलता ही रहता हूँ कि सोलर प्लांट लगाना है या फिर विंड प्लांट बनाना है या फिर आपको गोबर गैस प्लांट लगाना है, तो इन सब केस के लिए आपको चीपर रेट मिलेंगे. पर वही अगर आपको लेट से सिगरेट प्लांट लगाना है, लिकर प्लांट बनाना है, वाइनरी बनानी है, तो फिर उस केस में आपको हायर रेट पे इंटरेस्ट मिलेगा. तो फिर गवर्नमेंट बाय दैट वे प्रमोट्स द सर्टन सेक्टर बाय नज. Then there are other tools as well. They are like the moral suasion or persuasion. Using this method, central bank advises commercial banks to follow certain policies regarding lending and credit. तो फिर अब वो RBI सेंट्रल बैंक्स को एडवाइजरीज देगा, नोटिफिकेशंस देगा, नोटिसेस देगा, मतलब जो भी डॉक्यूमेंट्स प्रोवाइड करेगा, और या फिर इनफॉर्मली RBI उनको बताएगा कि वी नीड टू प्रमोट दी women entrepreneurs. So that acts as a nudge, as a persuasion, as a moral suasion to the banks to give more and cheaper loans to women entrepreneurs. Then there's a direct action में क्या है कि banks guidelines नहीं देती, RBI strict action देता है. अब वो क्या बोलेगा कि if you don't do this then I will impose penalty on you. I'll say like you will be penalized 5 lakh rupees. If you don't do it, I'll deny you दी क्रेडिट फैसिलिटीज. मैं तुम्हारे साथ में रेपो ही नहीं करूंगा, मैं तुम्हें डिस्काउंटिंग का पार्ट ही नहीं बनने दूंगा. तो फिर विथ ऑल ऑफ दिस RBI कंट्रोल्स द ओवरऑल क्रेडिट. सो दिस वे वी हैव एक्चुअली लाइक कवर्ड द एंटायर मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स. इसके बाद भी अगर कुछ डिटेल्स बचेगा तो फिर आई विल गिव देम एज अ हैंडआउट. आई होप द mechanism through which the monetary policy transmission takes place, I hope like you are now comfortable with all the monetary policy instruments, they are functioning, they are working and so on. Please, this is very central area. Understand how does like transmission takes place, how does money supply actually working, because इससे दो क्वेश्चन तो पक्का आते हैं, and these concepts are actually interlinked to the banking, which will be our next topic. These are linked with the fiscal policy, these are linked with the foreign exchange and external sector. तो इसीलिए आई कंप्लीट दिस सेक्टर फर्स्ट, बट द एंटायर कॉन्सेप्ट मस्ट बी वेरी क्रिस्टल क्लियर टू यू. I hope like this is helping you a lot. If you have any questions, any doubts, you can of course, and you should like get back to me. Till then, study well, keep revising, keep understanding, be obsessed with the studies that you are doing, and of course and always like I say, Jai Hind from my side.